young adulthood. Like, it's not the waiting room. Like, it's not like like when we talk about singlehood, like singlehood is not necessarily just like the waiting room vocation. And I think it's the same for young adulthood. It's not just waiting for the next thing. Like, there's a beauty in the present, in the unfinished, in the ambiguous things in the present. Welcome to the In Spirit podcast from Amoris Christi. Join us as we explore current events and all manner of fascinating topics and explore their connections to Christian living.
All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the In Spirit podcast. Today we have Chris joining us as usual, and then we have special guest Simi Sahu. Welcome, Simi. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you guys.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
So Simi is a Consecrated Virgin for the Diocese of Palm Beach, and got the privilege of yesterday on the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes to celebrate the feast and also Simi's 4th anniversary of consecration. So it's a really beautiful day for Simi and her vocation. But what we want to talk a little bit about today, Simi, is young adulthood, and talking a little bit more about navigating young adulthood. But just what do you guys both think? Like, young adulthood is such a crucial time, or some of the challenges. Yeah,
like even as you're saying that, like the first thing that comes to my mind is, in recent, I suppose, decades, like young adulthood is a period of life that's sort of emerged out of the in between from like graduating college and like entering a state of life vocation. And I think that is how it's been seen for a lot of recent history. It's an in-between time. It's what you do between when you have a very defined track in life, like being in college and all the things that accompany that, and then of course later on going into marriage or the priesthood or religious life, or consecrated virginity. So yeah, I think that there is something that's still a little bit ambiguous just about young adulthood and what it means. And to Simi's point, to your point, it's interesting how there are so many resources out there for campus ministry. There's so many resources out there for like family ministry, but young adulthood seems to kind of be coming up from behind the others. So yeah, it seems like a unique time of life, also one that we're still, as a whole, as a church, as a society, still kind of discovering.
Yeah. What do you think, Simi? Is there some, I know Christy brought up a couple of points which we'll hope to expand on a little bit more about, finding yourself, state of life, but is there some unique challenges that you see in young adulthood?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a couple of things that mark young adulthood in my mind is, one is it can be a transient time. Like I mentioned before, people can be moving. Your career can change even between undergrad and graduate school. Some things can happen. Of course, if you're discerning your vocation, or even within marriage, who you're discerning with can change a lot. Family, there's a lot of things going on with family. So there's so many moving parts. And on one hand, you have a certain responsibility of being an adult and showing up to work like everybody else. But you're also just kind of like, oh no, I'm the adult in the room all of a sudden, and right. I haven't been that. And then I think there can be this awkwardness of you don't fit back in with maybe your friends from undergrad or who are still in school, but you're not settled the way a lot of people at work might be. Who I remember just some people talking about blinds for like 35 minutes at work, and I know that because I was timing it. I was just like, is this like what life will be like, talking about blinds for 35 minutes? But now that I'm 35 and have a home, I would fully talk about it for 35 minutes. There's so many things to it. But you're not in that super settled way, the way a lot of people at work might be or in your church might be, but you're also not a kid anymore. So there can be an awkwardness. Obviously, there's a lot of young adults, but typically you're not in a concentrated place. And even if there are other young adults, there's typically so many things that are different about them that it can feel kind of extra solitary.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a transition time in a way, right? Like you're moving on from your college education into a time of, maybe finding yourself a little bit. And I think in our conversation as well, you had shared like how young adulthood is a time where, you don't no longer have people telling you what to do. It's now you have to start making decisions on your own. And there's a little bit of, challenge with that, you feel the weight of the responsibility for the first time, I guess, in your life too.
Yeah, you're really off the guide rails. Like in college, there's guide rails. In high school, there's guide rails. Like there's always a certain track to follow. And then all of a sudden, like it's like the train tracks end and you're a young adult. And like you have in a new way, like Father Thomas, I know, has used the word agency, like when he's talking about young adulthood. Like you have full active control over all these areas of life that you just have never had control over before. Like, sure. Where do I put my time? Where do I put my money? Where do I put like my interests? Like, what are my priorities?
Yeah. Sure. And it is beautiful discovering that, actually, as you were saying that, it just brought me to the first time I started living by myself, and I was like, for dinner, I was like, okay, now I can eat popcorn and ice cream for dinner. It's like the best thing ever.
For me, it was apple pie. I was like, I have money now. I can go to the store and just like buy an apple pie.
So it's like, it is pretty cool, like I think money is another thing. You start earning money for the first time. Yeah.
You can travel and all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's also this underlying fear that can also develop. I know I felt that during my post-college, like first job, second job years of, you're also very aware that whatever choices you're making in terms of maybe a romantic relationship, if you're dating, or, career-wise, what you're doing and, what you're studying and what you're gearing towards, the kind of circles that you're getting into, there's also this awareness that you're kind of setting a trajectory. Of course, you can change it later in life, but there's kind of almost more weight than ever has been before, and this awareness that it's coming. So I think it can also come with a little bit of internal pressure, I think, of just knowing, wow, like my decisions count for a lot. Am I doing enough? Am I doing too little? Is it too much? So like you said, the guardrails are off, and then it's just like kind of figuring out what structure do I create for myself.
Yeah. And I think one thing I think, it's good for us to understand as well is like, it can be, a time of figuring out, and that you can feel the weight of that responsibility too. But I also think, the easy option is just to go with the flow, go with what everyone else is doing. And I think, that it is a crucial time for building our foundations, of finding who we are, discovering our meaning, purpose in life. And I think, that agency, that, just being willing to take that is an important part of young adulthood.
Yeah, and I think part of why we feel the gravity or the weight of that responsibility so much is because I know that these decisions are mine. I can't put it on somebody else like I could have maybe in a previous time of my life. I can't say, well, I'm going to this thing because my parents told me to, or I'm going to this class because I have to do this to graduate. Like, and I remember even in my own life seeing friends who just thrived because like they had a sense of trajectory and purpose. And then I also had friends who just like really took a long time to get going in life because there was no aim.
Yeah.
I saw that like it was a suffering for them,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as you were saying that too, as both of you guys were sharing, I think, recently we got a chance to read a little bit with The Grand Inquisitor by Dostoevsky. And I think that's one thing, the weight of the decision of the weight of responsibility, you actually start feeling that in young adulthood.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's easier to just go with what everyone else is doing rather than take that decision on yourself. But I think, making that decision by yourself is crucial in that young adulthood and, finding your purpose and discovering your meaning. Right.
And I mean, even if we think about it, once you're married or consecrated or ordained or in a religious community, you're paying a mortgage, you have a job where you're expected to show up consistently. I just had someone sharing recently about how it was the first time they worked this month a 40-hour work week back to back, and they just can't believe that people do this for their life. Just how much it takes to he was just like, oh, I can't hide behind a computer and just lay in my bed and finish my essay. Like, I actually have to look presentable. So of course there's all those different things, but if we also think about it, there's no other better time to really look deep within at my particular history, maybe my family of origin, the gifts that I've received, the challenges that maybe I have, addressing we all have baggage, addressing at least some of the baggage that I have, or coming to a self-awareness, figuring out like what aspects of my faith are most important to me, what are my thoughts on what community and frankly the world should be like, and what is my small or not so small contribution going to be like, basically, and even what kind of family or what kind of vocation I want to build. Those are questions that will continue, but as you know, a consecrated virgin with a home and, you know, inscribed into a diocese with a job, I don't have nearly the same latitude that someone who is in their young adult years has. So even just that ability to go deep within, to heal, to address things, and for that to actually affect how I'm making my choices for the future, it's really a powerful time. Yeah. And I think it's a call for the church and for all of us to be more attentive to young adults. And like you're saying, you know, sometimes the gravity of the weight of how beautiful this time is can almost make everybody shrink away, young adults and the people who can be accompanying them. Yeah. But instead, if we can lean in a little bit with the Lord and with courage, the dividends it pays, I think, in terms of long-term shifts, could be very significant.
Yeah. And I think, you know, like, I think as you were sharing that too, like the aspect of growing in prayer, you know, is, you know, this is a journey with the Lord as well. And, you know, that aspect of growing in prayer and laying that foundations for that, for your future, or even during those years, it's young adulthood becomes an important aspect, right?
Yeah, definitely. Even as you're both sharing, the thought that comes to my mind is how John Paul II would say things like how the ultimate fulfillment basically in every person's life comes through making a sincere gift of himself or herself. But there's in order to make that full gift of yourself, you have to know what you're giving. Like, you have to know yourself, you have to know what you are able to give. And it's sort of like, in some sense, it's like you have to take yourself up in order to lay yourself down. Yeah. So I think that in a particular way, like the young adult phase of life is primed for that, taking myself up so that I can lay myself down. I mean, that's the way I've experienced it, that I continue to experience it as someone who's really still in that phase of life, but rapidly phasing out of it and feeling it more each year. But like, no, there is something to it where it's like, this is the time of my life where I do like figure out what I can take up so that I can lay it down. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also like your actions that you do in your young adult, they do have consequences, right? I mean, whatever you invest in, you know, you invest your time in prayer, you invest your time in friends, you invest your time in that healing process, self-awareness. They do have consequences, not just later in life, but even during those young adult years. So I do think like, you know, what you do and how you do it, how you go about it, it becomes very crucial, especially in young adulthood, because like you said, it's that time of, you know, finding yourself and understanding the gifts that you are, right?
Yeah. But along with that, I think that also contributes to the challenge, is like knowing there's so many different important things that have these consequences for my future. And at least what I've heard people say and even felt it in myself is like, where the heck do I start? Yeah. Like, where do I even begin? Right. And I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that is like a significant part of the challenge. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It can feel overwhelming.
I think some of the things that can be helpful can be being attentive to the movements of our hearts. I know Anthony and I were both deeply moved by a Scalabrini priest, Father Isaiah, and Anthony is discerned to be a priest. He's in seminary, about to be, receive minor orders soon.
Subdeacon.
Shout out. He'll be blessing fruits and nuts. So we're looking forward to that. Okay. But actually it was Father Isaiah's love and being who he was. And there's another priest, Father Melvin, who was also deeply moved by him during Haiti mission. So I don't think any of us were really thinking about celibacy as a real option of our vocational future. It was just like, we're open, sure. But actually seeing how beautifully he lived out his life, there was something deep within that moved all of us. And it wasn't like we were thinking, priesthood or celibacy right away, but just I think being attentive to who are the people that have moved me. For me, certain JY families and their option for keeping their homes open even when it was inconvenient, maybe passing up that promotion that came away so that they could have a quality family life and continue investing in the church, and others who actually intentionally do invest in work so that they can be more excellent. But which of those are more deeply moving my heart? So just to be attentive to those things can be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think like that question of where do I start? I think this is a great place to start, and I think on being aware of the movements of your heart. And I think Father Jasani, the founder of Communion Liberation, he uses this great term called honor your ignorance. What do you not know about? What is the beauty that moves you? What is it that you want to find in yourself? And his idea of honoring that things that move you and allowing that to kind of lead you. I think that's a great place, I think, for me to start, that honor your ignorance.
Yeah. Maybe looking at this from a parallel point of view, I was thinking back to a conversation I had with a friend maybe a few months back about young adulthood, and he had like all these different responsibilities that some of which he enjoyed, some of which I think he was just doing out of obligation. And after a certain point, I just said, like, dude, give yourself permission to have hobbies, to have fun. That's part of it too. Like, even along with what you're saying and what we're talking about, like, what are your interests? Like, especially if you happen to grow up in an environment where maybe you didn't have the space given to explore your interests, like, this is the time where you actually are able to do that. Yeah. Like in a real way, in a deeper way than maybe what came before and maybe even what comes after. Like, what do you like to do? What is fun for you? Those are all things that are actually valid questions, and we don't always treat them as valid when we get hung up on like these big responsibilities.
Yeah, and in that sense, it is really a beautiful time when you think about it. It is really an adventure, that you get to discover new things about yourself, find new things, even at work. I think one of the beautiful things about young adulthood is like finding your purpose, finding your meaning in the workplace too, right? And I think, what is it that you love, figuring that out, it becomes a really beautiful time for that too.
Yeah. Also too, with attentiveness along with what moves me deeply, I think also just noticing what grieves me deeply and what triggers me deeply. Those are also good questions because grief is also deeply connected to love. So that may be actually a deeper calling to address something in the world or something in my community. And then also just noticing what are the things that bother me. I know for me, I've been blessed with living with different women in different seasons of life in Chicago, Florida, different places. And one of the gifts was in pretty much every setting we were able to talk and decide to actually engage rather than just living like ships passing in the sea, which is very possible as young adults to do the bare minimum, maybe have a chore schedule or just like something like that. But if we can actually be a little bit more intentional about our relationships and actually talking things through. I know for one young woman who lived with me, we just kind of decided between ourselves that we'd let each other know if we were just not okay, and just the other person's happy to give space, but because it was just the two of us living together, that guessing game would just become difficult. And then through that, I think both of us just recognized so many patterns that we had, or when we pull back, when we go too hard. So these friendships, whether it's with people you're living with or people you're deeply engaging with, can be such a beautiful preparation for marriage or life in religious life or priesthood. In consecrated virginity, of course. So it doesn't need to be all meaningless, living situations, and then boom, like you're married and or in a community and now you need to figure it out. But that kind of investment intentionally, and of course, not just investing one way, but also asking the other person, if they would want to engage as well, that can be a huge gift. And My goodness, I literally know spouses who've thanked their, spouses' friends for all the gifts where this person can tell me what bothers me. This person can tell me how to take care of me. This person can tell me, what they're mapping in their head. Imagine not having to do that within your vocation. It can be a huge gift.
Yeah, I think you touched on a great point there of like how important it is to have good friends in your young adult years. And, we had an episode on friendship, but yeah, I think the friendships do really make a significant difference in young adulthood. I know for me, as different, even there was no physically, there wasn't close friends, but even during that young adult years, there was like people, long distance friends that would keep in touch with me. So I think it is very formative, those friends actually that you have. And like you said, there's a certain influence and that you grow on each other. And so, it is really beautiful to have that good holy friendships during young adult years.
Yeah. And I guess continuing the theme, finding community. We talked about this in the friendship episode as well, but like friendship is a need, community is a need, but they're not the same thing. Like they're both needs that we all have individually, but those don't always look the same. And community, of course, like scales on different levels. Like anytime you live with roommates, it's a community. And even as you're talking about your roommate experiences, Simi, like, yeah, I've definitely seen a spectrum of my own experiences with that microcosm of community. But like in a bigger way, like where do I find belonging? Where do I find a sense of shared values and shared purpose? Yeah. And then of course, like along with that, like you're saying, friendship, like, having that individual sharing in another person's life one-on-one, like rejoicing in their joys. Like, yeah, I mean, it all unfolds in every stage of life, but, and we've mentioned it several times, just how unique young adulthood is as a phase of life for the absolute, I think Simi used the word laterality or something close to that, like latitude, I think. Like just the fact that you can go any which way in a way that is not really possible in other times of life. One time I was hearing this, actually she's a Catholic speaker who is in her young adult years. And she said, like, I love what I do and I love being a young adult. And I love that, like, for this phase of life, like, I'm not married right now because I do want to be married one day. But I love that if a parish, like, 3 states away calls me and says, like, can you give a talk? Like, we had a last minute cancellation. I could be like, I'll get the next flight. Like, there's a freedom that's there. That's not possible later. And it also kind of reminds me of another thing that comes up in relation to how we talk about young adulthood. Like, it's not the waiting room. Like, it's not like like when we talk about singlehood, like singlehood is not necessarily just like the waiting room vocation. And I think it's the same for young adulthood, excuse me. It's not just waiting for the next thing. Like, there's a beauty in the present, in the unfinished, in the ambiguous things in the present.
Yeah, I think we also, in our conversation too, before we had talked about like, the young adulthood can be, there's immense possibility within your young adult years. Yeah. And discovering that is part of being that young adulthood. And, whether it's in work, whether it's in prayer, because I remember prayer was during young adult years was so beautiful. I got to discover Teze and use that every day and, falling in love with Jesus through the sacraments, discovering spiritualities. It became really like a beautiful time of just falling in love with the Lord over and over again. So I think there is immense possibility with the young adult years.
I was also thinking about how entire new areas of your life can come up. For me, I had someone in Jesus Youth who just encouraged me and said a word of affirmation that I did a great job writing minutes in the meeting and that I wasn't making stuff up or distracted, which is just like, it doesn't seem like a high compliment, but I was just like, sure. But then I think that little compliment just kind of encouraged me, I want to write more. And over time, writing just became such an important part of how I love people and how I'm able to serve. It's not formal writing that's getting published, but it's become a significant part of my life. Or I was asked to teach a little class and I didn't feel very ready for it. I was kind of pushed into it, and teaching is one of the things I probably most enjoy. and feel most fruitful in. So I'm thinking about how I think sometimes we feel like we'll be, it'll be one of the things that we were working on since we were children, and not that those things don't get pulled in, but there's things that can come up in your young adult years that can actually become a big part of your whole life in ways that can be surprising as well. So there's still that childhood-like possibility within young adult years as well.
Wow.
Yeah, and not being afraid to be surprised, that God
by
always
yourself.
Yeah, I think,
And it kind of reminds me about also just having the holding things in tension. So just like you guys were saying, you don't want to coast and just go with the flow, but the opposite extreme can be filling your schedule with so many things that you don't even have time to know what you feel like to yourself or what it feels like to exist. And the other extreme can also be, the two other extremes we can fall into is either being so much in a discovery and being on a high and I'm free, I can do everything and can go everywhere, or just like I need to become stable and I need to achieve structure in my life. So some combination of growing towards maturity and repetition and expertise, but also having room for learning and growth and new areas being opened up. I think finding a sense of that balance within the tension can be a rich gift.
That's beautiful, actually. Yeah, it's a great observation, I think. And also not being afraid to fail. I think too, failure doesn't define us.
Yeah, and we've certainly talked about it before too.
Yeah. And I think, even when Brother Emil was here, I think he talked about failure as, he said that he would see failure as making a decision based on what happened in the past, and not allowing what happened in the past to kind of be the sole factor that determines what you're going to do next. And so I think, not being afraid to fail, I think becomes an important part of young adulthood and in navigating that. Because sometimes I can see, for me, I can see myself, I try something new and it didn't work out. So I just want to be get stuck in that phase. And so insecurity. So I can see that. Yeah.
So I realize that we didn't mention this at the beginning, but we'll take a straw poll. What are the ages of young adulthood? What's the cutoff point? Because it seems like it gets longer and longer each year, just based on the way we're moving culturally. But where do you put the marker for young adulthood?
I don't know. Are we saying 35?
I usually go for the classic 18 to 35.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. 18 to 35.
But I've heard 40.
Okay.
I've heard 30.
39.
39.
I've heard 39. Yeah. Yeah, I do want to touch about two things that both of you guys has mentioned. One was finding community in young adulthood, and then also state of life. So what do you guys think about that young adulthood? And, many times people are not, it's like what you said, Simi, you don't really vibe, or, you don't think college students or college going kids are they can be part of your life, but you don't develop strong friendships with them.
Sure.
But at the same time, there might not be at young adults that you're looking for. So is there any thoughts on finding community within young adulthood?
Finding your community.
Yeah.
I'll kind of go off of a little bit of what Chris was saying earlier with differentiating between community and friendships, even though there's an obvious overlap. So maybe not being in a position where you're completely isolated and just, researching stuff online, which is also very good, and reading is very good, investing deeply. So one thing can be just being present to the local community, and if possible, where young adults are around, of course, doing that a little bit, because we all need to be around people to engage, to be healthy, basically, and hopefully new and good friendships come. But the other way can be, again, that attentiveness to what really matters to me. What are some of the causes? Because I'm sure if you've had a podcast on friendship, it's come up about airtake friendships, the friendships that are built on something deep. So if you're in something that's deeply looking into the faith, or maybe something that's helping the environmental causes, or maybe some aspects of justice or catechesis. So whatever's passionate without necessarily pigeonholing yourself into it. Can you find something meaningful? I heard recently about people have these Chesterton clubs, and It's just like, oh my goodness, can I redo my young adult years and be part of something like that?
Yeah.
I would imagine going to something that's popular enough but niche enough would bring you closer to people who have those values. And if you don't meet anyone there that you'd want to be friends with, at the very least you're furthering in your interests. But the chances of building more meaningful relationships that you would want to invest in are probably higher when you're actually looking at something that's important enough and big enough to engage with.
Yeah, and you hit on an important point about how did you say it? Like niche enough, but
Popular
enough. Yeah, yeah. It's funny because sometimes I think we, as Catholics, we think like, well, we're all Catholic. We share the same values, and that's really an integral part of community is like having shared sense of values. So in a broad sense, we're part of the same community, just all being Catholics. But there's like an incredible number of communities within the church, and you learn very quickly that not everybody has the exact same values as you do. Yeah. Shocking. Yeah. But like, yeah, there's like room in the church for like a Chesterton club, but then there's also plenty of people who don't necessarily vibe with that. And that, I think, is part of the issue that we're seeing on a more, I'll call it ecclesial level when it comes to addressing young adult years is sure. There is so much variety. There's like you're talking about people like discovering themselves and people who think like them and share a sense of purpose, direction, values. There's so much room in the church for so many different kinds of little communities like that. Mm-hmm. And trying to address it as a whole is, honestly, I think from an ecclesial perspective, it's very tricky.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this too, but I think in our present day and age, it's ever more important to put yourself out there.
Yeah.
That you have to be intentional about making friendships and about keeping up with relationships, about finding your community. So, yeah, I guess that applies to young adulthood as well, is what I would say. But just touching on another point I want to touch on is the state of life. And vocation discernment. I know it's a broader topic, but like I think when Chris, you were saying that it's no longer a waiting room, I think many times the question that comes up with young adulthood is, oh, how's vocation discernment? Or, when you're going to get married? Those are kind of the questions that come up. Simi, I don't know from your experience with Anointed and Sent, like how do you guys kind of navigate that, accompany young people through that?
Sure. I think part of the challenge is when you're of age to be making that decision, there can just be, even if you're 99% sure you're called to religious life, there's so many religious orders, and if you want to date, there's different people and there's different things going on. So there's just a lot of pressure, and then there can be a lot of choices. So one of the things we found is it can help to kind of take a couple of steps back into your own heart. And what you were saying earlier, Anthony, thank you for emphasizing the role of prayer more deeply as a dialogue and a friendship with God that helps me to get to know myself. And then from that place, being more attentive to what the Lord wants of me, what I've deeply wanted. There's all these seeds and beautiful things the Lord has already been placing in my life. A vocation can be a surprise, as when a flower blossoms, it feels like a surprise, but it's also been building up to it. Yeah. So I think that aspect of it can feel like you're going back to look at your history. It can feel like, going back to prayer and building a prayer life versus, going into something and then figuring it out. You may be called to, take the next step and learn how to pray, within a seminary application season or a novitiate or while you're dating, or maybe you're called to, if the Lord's just kind of opening up your life in a certain way. I think approaching deeper things in prayer, putting yourself in situations and the kinds of, beautiful saints and writings that can draw you in deeper can help you be in touch with more of what's already been moving in your heart. And that continuation, that deepening can lead to a greater strength and clarity to know, what I'm called to. Discernment's always choosing between goods. It's not choosing, should I sin mortally or venially? Like, that's not what we're discerning. We're discerning between all good things. So in one sense, there's a high matter of subjectivity that's involved. So is my subjectivity being conditioned by what Netflix is going to suggest to me next? Or is it going to be conditioned by what's filling up my imagination in prayer, what my friends and I are talking about? So I think going back to the sources of depth in your life and going deeper into healing, and also in action, where am I bearing fruit? Where are things kind of engaging? Those can be helpful places. So go deeper to go higher.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I think that young adulthood in a particular way is I would call it a call to adventure.
Yeah.
It's a call to adventure with the Lord. And I guess I'll say in some sense a call to adventure with myself on some level, to be adventurous in going into the depths of who I am, and what is most important to me, and how I want to make a gift of my life, which, at least in my own life, I think that's been kind of a overarching question throughout my young adult years, is how do I want to make a gift of my life? But of course, the fulfillment of that answer really lies in the heart of the Lord.
Sure.
So I think that even as we've touched all these different points, things that come up in young adulthood, the challenges, there's so many dimensions that we didn't even touch, like just dealing with loneliness, dealing with stress, juggling responsibilities, but fundamentally it's the time of our lives where we really enter into a phase where we can begin to fully flourish in a way that maybe we couldn't do in earlier phases of life, because it's me taking up my life with the Lord and running and seeing where things are going.
Yeah, and finding joy in that, right?
Yeah.
And discovering joy in that. I think, there is such a joy in, finding yourself, in that healing process, in discovering meaning in work, in that discovering your state of life. I think there's such immense joy in that, and that for us to discover that and that journey with the Lord.
Yeah.
And I think, that's why the young adult years are so crucial in that sense, right? There is immense possibility and hope there.
I was also thinking how important it is to be in situations that you may not necessarily think you'll like. I'm thinking about when I was studying theology, I was convinced I would hate church history and moral theology. I was just I know I'm a sinner. I don't need to know all the details. Jesus, I've sinned. Please forgive me. I don't want to know the details. That's not what moral theology is, turns out. And church history was probably one of my favorite classes. So I was surprised that the two classes in my mind when I was looking at the list that I was least interested in, things like Trinity, I was just I'm going to love that. Marriage, theology of the body, I'm interested. I want to know more. But yeah, those were the two ones. But that was part of the benefit of having a framework that I wouldn't put for myself. So, and I know for a lot of us who've discerned celibacy also, it might have caught us off guard. For me, when I was living in Haiti with a whole bunch of, there were 2 seminaries, a bunch of priests, 7 different congregation of religious sisters. And I mean, I'd never felt attracted to religious life before, not even once. And I can't say that I felt an intellectual or felt attraction to any of the orders there, but I noticed at one point, oh my goodness, I feel so much at peace living basically the contours of a consecrated life, praying 5 times a day, being tired, putting my whole day for the church, and then resting in solitude with Jesus in prayer with no one there. That actually gave me the joy that I'd hoped for in marriage. My parents would have tea in the evenings together, chai, and discuss the day. And that was kind of the image that I had of what I wanted in marriage, is someone to have tea with in the evenings and just talk about the day, someone who I would want to get to know, who I would want to share with, who would be interested in me. And I realized that person was very much Christ. I really wanted to get to know him. So it wasn't in the way that I thought vocation stories go. We all have a really good friend, common friend here, Brother Benedict, who's a monk from Portsmouth Abbey. He was actually discerning to be a Jesuit, and he just happened to go to a monastery to make his retreat, his discernment retreat, to join the Jesuits. And then at some point, the connection was made that he was where he belonged in a different way.
Yeah.
And I know people have had that with marriage as well. You know, someone that they didn't feel attracted to. They were in a new place and a new situation, and all of a sudden they looked and, wow, I see this person differently.
Oh.
So exactly. So I think leaving room for surprise. So as good as it is to go deeper into our interests and things that we like, and, you know, going into those niche popular things, there's also something very beautiful about being in situations that could surprise us in ways that we're not thinking about just yet.
Yeah, and that need to be open, right, to what God wants to work in you. I think that's probably crucial in the young adult years too.
And open to the present situation. As we've sort of talked about in different ways, like there's a beauty in the present moment with all the ambiguity and questions, like, but being aware of like how my heart's being stirred by the things that are happening around me, by the people I'm around, the experiences that I'm having. And I can't do that if I'm either looking ahead, like far into the future, and sacrificing the present as I do so. I'm not saying like don't have plans or dreams. It's more just don't pull yourself away from the present. And then of course there's like the other extreme of just not engaging at all. But like if I can allow myself to be present to what's happening and attentive to my interior world, my interior life, and grow in that and grow in it with the Lord and become aware of what is stirring in me, then all of a sudden, like, yeah, the ambiguities are kind of second importance at that point, because there's something beautiful unfolding inside of my own heart that, I mean, it's part of that adventure, like we were saying before.
Yeah, beautiful. I think we've covered plenty of stuff at this point, so about the young adult years. But I think for me, the biggest takeaway is like how investing in your young adult years is so crucial, and the immense hope and the possibility that happens because of taking young adult years seriously. Not saying people don't take it seriously, but also it's a place of finding joy as well. So, yeah. Simi, just wanted to ask about where people can find more about Anointed and Sent, the young adult program, and how people can find you. And we'll put it in the show notes as well, the links. But
Sure.
yeah.
Thank you for asking. You can go to amoruschristi.org, and there's a page under there for Anointed and Sent. And we try to be active on Instagram. We're sometimes more so than others.
Oh, nice.
So our handle is Anointed and Sent on Instagram. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think recently started a podcast about with fellow Consecrated Virgins. So could you share a little bit about that as well, and where people can find that?
Sure. Thanks for asking about that as well. It's called Wildflower Reunion. So it's a little play on words, just because we think of religious life as, and monastic life as flowers that were planted exactly where they are for a reason and carefully curated, versus consecrated virginity just kind of popping out without anyone quite planting it in any particular place. So there's 4 of us, consecrated virgins. One's from London. Her name is Hannah. She works in parish renewal. There's Dawn, who is a vocations director for Lansing Diocese, and then Karen Irvin, who is a elementary school principal, and me. The 4 of us, we just talk about different aspects of our vocation. So if you can join us, we would love that.
I guess basically Anointed and Sent and Wildflower Reunion will solve your young adult problems.
You heard it here, folks. But Simi, thanks for joining our podcast.
It's such a joy.
Thanks, Simi. All right, guys. Peace.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the In Spirit podcast. In Spirit is an initiative of Amoris Christi, an apostolate dedicated to lay spiritual formation. For more information and to keep up to date, you can visit our website at amoruschristi.org and follow us on social media.